People always ask me, is there an easier way to bind a quilt, like on the sewing machine or a new foot? And on the Husqvarna Viking, the quilt binder has finally made a debut in my sewing room, and I have spent the day really mastering this so I can show you the shortcuts of working around an actual quilt. Now, speaking of quilts, I just want to show you what's behind me. These are actually some of our Stitching Cosmos online course quilts, but these are actually extra special for me today because the black and white quilt and the gray and the light gray quilt were actually blocks students made on day one of their class at our store, and they gave them to me and I put them together in a keepsake quilt to remember where their journey started. So if you want more information on our Stitching Cosmos online course, it will take you through 25 different sewing techniques and 18 different presser feet on the sewing machine. So no embroidery is done on any of those. And remember, those are just what they accomplished on day one, working with their decorative stitches. So I thought I'd show you what's going on. But I've been actually binding these small little quilts as I practice today of really understanding how the quilt binder was developed and what it's really used for. So in the package, when you open it up, everything's kind of folded together and compact. So the first thing you need to do is open this all the way up. And don't be afraid, it's nice and tight, but we do need to extend it to its full extension. Next, this is a very important piece. This is what actually attaches to your throat plate. Now, if you don't have one of the current machines, you need to have 2 holes in your throat plate now for this to attach to. So if you don't have 2 holes, you are going to want to contact your local dealer and have them locate the stitch plate for your machine. I do know that older machines have not had those holes added for the older throat plates, but like I said, just check with your dealer with your model number and see if one is available before you purchase a quilt binder. So I'm going to show you how this is put on. There's also a sole plate that comes with the box that goes on to the dual feed foot. It's one of the ones that actually magnetize on. And so that is one that you can use, but I'm going to actually show you a second option for using and putting on. And honestly, I was a little bit more successful in seeing where I'm going, and also I can't wait to show you how to turn corners using the Mega Piping Foot. So those are just a couple things to be aware of and what I'm using. Spray, best press, some spray starch is key. I actually keep a glue stick close by. I'm going to show you a special tip for ending the bias binding as you get back to where you started, and how to measure when to do the last little clip, and so it folds in just right and finishes with a non-raw edge. So a glue stick, but then I used the glue stick for those corners too, so I kind of became friends with my glue stick. You need some type of stiletto or sharp object. I always reach for my seam ripper. If you want, read my blog. I'll link that in the comments below, why I use a seam ripper, because it's sharp and I always need to take out a few stitches here and there. So that's my second best friend. And we are also going to need to cut strips that are 1 3/4 inch wide on the bias. Now, if you happen to have an AccuQuilt cutter for cutting strips, there is an AccuQuilt die for that will cut 1 3/4 inch strips. And then I have a special video you can link right up here to how to cut bias strips using an AccuQuilt cutter. So go check out that video as well. So I've already got my strips all cut, sewed together on the diagonal. My trick here is to use a nice short stitch length. I like it nice and close together, and then that way when I press those seams open, they're not going to come open like with a normal 2.5 stitch length. I usually go down to like 1.5. So keep that in mind when you sew your binding strips together. That helps hold them all together. So I think you do find that I think we are ready. I have this cute little quilt that is ready to bind, and I want to show you close up what it looks like to attach the quilt binder and get all the way around this square. Here are the 2 holes I was referring to. You're going to take the plate and attach it into the hole. And then we're going to take the bias binder, and it's going to sit right here, and these holes are going to be attached with a washer and a screw, and then you'll adjust. And this will be something that as you get started, you're going to need to test and see what works best for you. You're also going to fall in love with all the needle positions you have on a Husqvarna Viking, because you can dial in the binding exactly where you want. So as you have this slightly loosened, you are able to move this slightly left or right, and I kind of have an idea where I've been using it. It's fairly right about there. So let's go ahead and we'll just tighten those down, and I can adjust that as I go. And then next we're going to go ahead and I've already put on the Mega Piping foot, and I know that actually can go both ways, and I was just noticing I didn't try it the other way. It could, I can't tell you if it works the other way. I just put it on and it worked, and so you can actually attach it to the front side or the back side. That's why it's awesome. So you do slide it down the chute, and again, if you have that stiletto or something sharp, that will help slide it down. Now this is solid fabric, but I do want to make sure that my seam or the wrong side is facing us as we're stitching. And you can kind of see that there's this U shape that happens right down here at the end of the quilt binder. Back here though, we are going to make sure that this kind of gets held in this little kind of fence, and it is nicely secured. I've actually taken this and actually kind of hooked it up above my vertical spool pin over here. It stays out of the way and then doesn't keep the weight from dragging and catching. So that is something to kind of look for. So as I slide it in, you're noticing that the lips are actually providing this double fold as part of the awesomeness of the quilt binder. I can also see that I want to move my needle position a little bit to the left side, just to be a little bit closer to the edge. I also like a little longer stitch length. That longer stitch length helps pull everything in. I mean, we're talking about a quilt batting and back. We're going to go over seams. There's going to be a lot of layers. So a little longer stitch length always helps. Keep in mind your needle. I like to have a top stitch needle or something that is a sharp needle. That could be a denim needle as well. In my bobbin, I have matched the thread that I want to have for my binding, so same thread top and bottom. Because this does cover up the bobbin case door, you might want to make sure that you have a full bobbin before you start. It's not hard to take this off. I usually take off this screw when I change my bobbin, because then everything stays attached. So it's not hard to, just kind of have to stop and actually take it off to change your bobbin if you are running low. I am going to show you how to turn a corner. That's what everybody asks for. So I do want to get started. Because I have a longer tail back here, I am going to start kind of close to my corner, and so we're going to get to it right away when we get going. So I'm going to kind of slide this in, and I've actually given it a little finger press, and so it's actually kind of creased, and I want to just slip the quilt into the mouth. Now when we come back and finish this up, you're going to see that if it's not perfect when it starts, we can actually take out a few stitches, because we're coming right over the top of it when we're actually done. Just like anything, you are going to want to practice. I did hear a great quote today, which was perfect for as I was starting my journey in mastering this fabulous tool. And it said, "Don't let perfect be the enemy of good." So as you get started, even if it's not perfect, it's going to be good, and you're going to be done with your project. So I still bind quilts that are like my show quilts, the traditional way, by the French fold, or and then folding it over and hand stitching it to the back. But boy, there are so many things that I can just get done if you have the right tool. Slide that bias strip in and get stitching. So one thing I became is semi-left-handed for this application, because I've got my stiletto in my left hand. I'm actually just kind of letting the bias strip kind of get pressed down as I'm keeping it nice and close into the mouth of this particular tool. I'm going to just slip my little thread. Actually, that's okay. I'll just keep on stitching. I want to get right to the corner, because this is the most important part. So I'm going to stitch right to the edge. If you'd like to put a couple locking stitches, you can always use your fix button. And here is a trick. If you actually lift up the foot, I'm going to actually do two things. I'm going to lift up the foot, I'm going to slide forward just a little bit, and I'm actually letting the foot sit back down on my bias strip. And the reason for it is I want it to crease right there. I was noticing I was helping it crease just by letting the foot kind of step on it and be in place for a second, and then lifting it up. Notice I did not use my thread cutter. I like to keep my threads a little longer, and one tip I read about, actually I think I saw a video on, is if you leave the tails, you can actually come back if you need to and hand do a few stitches with those tails. I mean, you can do it just with regular needle and thread, but if you've got tails anyway, they're right close by. So the key right now is to take a couple pins and pin and connect the bias corner. So what are we looking at? We're looking at taking and practically creating a little nose and then pinching it in place and then getting it to crease so it will line up perfectly. I always do the back first because the back's the one you have to catch, or that's what you're trying to do. So by putting that here, this is where the glue came in, and I can pin that, but you know what I was trying is I put a little glue on that. So just a little thing. I don't think I had to do it, but now that I kind of started doing it, I really like it. So I'm going to put a little glue and just get that to kind of hold in place. And then I'll put a pin. I kind of put the pin on the back so you can kind of see and watch where that pin is once I kind of pull it back into position. Now I can actually put a little glue on the front side because I need to do the same thing here where I'm going to kind of reposition that. And you can put a pin where you'd like. You can kind of get that started. Look how perfect that's going to be. Next, it's to back everything into position. So I'm going to just take the strip and I'm pulling it on the other end here and backing it back in and do it as far as you can because then you really can get it to where you need it to be. You're going to sink that needle down. Maybe you do it by hand. Maybe you lower the presser foot down to kind of see where that's going to start. And if you want, you can even just make sure that this is kind of tucked far enough underneath to get started. So if you wanted to start off with some shorter stitches, because remember we did not use the thread cutter, so it's not going to take little locking stitches, but it's going to take a couple stitches right away. I'll start with like a stitch length of 1. So it's taking some stitches, barely moving forward, so it's definitely going to lock and then return it back to that longer stitch length of 3. And again, if you're worried about stitching on your pin, get that pulled out right away. And then get back to kind of helping this press down. This was my key, that when I kind of helped lower this down from the quilt binder in front of the foot, it stayed into position a little bit easier. This is just what worked for me, and I hope you'll give this plenty of tries, and don't just find that the first time is the only time, and especially, honestly, my first time didn't work for me. So if it turns out not good, I'm gonna have to say you gotta give it a few more tries and keep working at it until you find you can do it to your liking. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and do the remaining 3 corners, and I will meet you at the end for the perfect finish to this quilt binding. I'm about ready to overlap the end, and I want you to measure out about 7 inches. When you know you're going to come up and over your previous stitching from 7 inches from your needle, I'm going to show you the exact place to cut. Now, it doesn't look like it's going to be correct, but trust me, right here where this little fence starts, I want you to take your scissors and go ahead and cut even along that edge. So just go ahead and cut off your strip and take your glue stick and put just a strip of glue right along that edge and then fold it back just about 1/4 of an inch, and then you'll have a nice finished edge when we're all said and done. So we'll probably want to eliminate a little bit of this, and that's why I had you start a little bit closer to this corner, because if we had started up here, we wouldn't have had as easy of a way to measure, and if you're doing something smaller, you'd have to kind of play around with that. But here is our goal here. Now, another thing that we could have been doing on any of the stitching for the binding is we could have done a decorative stitch. We could have used clear thread, and don't tell anybody, but sometimes I have been known to put clear thread in my needle and my bobbin. So you can see that this is just going to come in down in, just maybe watch and make sure that it's looking good. And it's just going to come right over the top of your previous stitching. So just go ahead and kind of tuck it in if you feel like that's going to stick out a little bit. We are going to overlap a good healthy inch or so. So if you don't want that much overlap, again, you can plan to cover that up depending on your project. So just go ahead, stitch over the top of it. When it's all said and done, it is done. That's the key, is that it doesn't take long to actually get around an entire project. I'm going to do a couple lock stitches here and then cut the threads. Let's take a look and see how those corners actually turned out. If you found that you missed anything, now I did have a little seam that landed right here. This was a little tricky here. Oh, but I caught my edge on the back side. Oh, look at me. All right, I know sometimes I'm just as surprised, but here, if you wanted to take any of these threads, you can cut them close, or you could even use them if you like to kind of stitch your binding down right at the corners. We'll take this pin out. Oh, we did that one, and it is done. So how exciting. This is something that, again, give yourself a little practice and definitely give the quilt binder a try. If you are working on some curved items, you definitely will love the Mega Piping Foot for that feature. I did find that much easier when going around curved edges, and I hope you've enjoyed this. Maybe I'll see you at the Stitching Cosmos course online. Click on the links below this YouTube video, and we'll see you next time.